Hello and welcome to part 2 of a presentation on logic and fallacies. My name is Jeff Turner. I'm a tutor at the Writing Center at Old Dominion University. Let's do a quick recap of what we covered in part 1. Last week we talked about the most common types of fallacies, and we'll continue to talk about those this week. We covered 2 categories of fallacies. 1, evasions, and 2, oversimplifications. We went into the details of evasions last week, and this week we'll talk about the details of oversimplifications, which is basically any attempt to diminish an argument to alter the way it appears or its substance. These are the specific evasions we talked about last week, and these are the specific oversimplifications we'll talk about this week. Hasty generalization. Basically, any claim made without having sufficient experience or proof, or in research having a sufficient sample size. Clearly, in the example sentence, we know that Ferraris come in other colors than yellow. And just because this person saw one Ferrari in yellow certainly does not mean that all Ferraris are yellow. False dilemma. Anytime somebody demands that you make a choice between two things, it's probably a false dilemma. There's usually more than one option in a given situation. Look at the 2 example sentences and you'll get the idea. Absolute statement. These ones should be pretty obvious and should be pretty easy to recognize. They have really common keywords like always, never, all, none. Very rarely is anything as absolute or pure as a person would like it to be. And clearly we know all dogs do not have white fur. Some dogs have black fur. And that makes that statement untrue. Stereotype. We should be pretty familiar with these. It's not necessarily true that all bald, bearded men are wise. And clearly, that doesn't characterize an entire group of people. Post hoc. This can be sort of tricky. Typically, when we say if A, then B, then we assume that there's some sort of relationship, causal or some sort of correlation between A and B. This isn't necessarily true. And if you look at the example sentence, it's easy to see that we can reason our way out of what this student believes. There may be a reason that a correlation that this student is getting A's and hasn't showered, but it may not be the cause, the direct cause. So maybe because they're not showering, they're spending that time in the shower, they're spending that time studying, and they're getting A's. So there's clearly a relationship there, but it's not a direct cause. False analogy. We often see this one in advertisements, comparing two things as similar or some element of them that's similar, but really they have nothing in common. And a famous one is, how is a raven like a writing desk? And Lewis Carroll was prompting his readers in a journal to sort of see the false analogy. And he actually ended up getting a whole bunch of clever replies back that he was forced to publish and pay the readers. So how do we recognize fallacies? Well, remember some of the symptoms and cues. Usually if it's a cliche or if it's some sort of accepted wisdom or some sort of colloquial phrase, there's probably a good chance there's a fallacy hidden in there somewhere. Poorly formed or oddly formed thoughts are usually a good sign that a fallacy is occurring. Remember begging the question we talked about last week. If you have some sort of emotional reaction, if you laugh at something, that's a good sign that there's a fallacy going on. And not necessarily is it a bad thing that it's a fallacy. Maybe it's a satire. Maybe they're using fallacy intentionally. But those emotional reactions or even anger is a good sign that the logic is being skewed and that there's a fallacy present. Watch for qualifications such as, I don't usually say this, or I don't usually do that. Well, that's usually a good sign that they're trying to sell you something. watch for absolute statements, always, never, all, none, um, though only. Those sort of statements usually lead to fallacies because rarely is anything pure. Is it always or never a given set of circumstances? How do you recognize them? Well, really, the best way I can suggest that you recognize fallacies is to become a critical thinker. And that doesn't mean you have to become cynical, but that does mean that you should be skeptical. You should question people's motivation and what they stand to gain from making a particular argument in a particular way. And ask questions: who, what, when, where, why, how. Ask for specifics, ask for details, and trust your intuition. If you sense that something is wrong or something seems odd, pursue it. And of course, practice. The more you become familiar with logical fallacies, the easier it becomes to recognize them. And how do you avoid them? Well, again, recognizing other people's is really the same technique as recognizing them in your own writing. And be critical of your own thinking. If you find that you're using cliches or absolute statements in your writing, try to edit them out. Try to perhaps be a little bit more critical of yourself and challenge yourself to think in new and different directions. And of course, practice. And we'll go through a couple examples right now, some old print advertisements. I suggest that when you get to them, that you actually pause and read over the advertisement and then listen to the explanation or the answer. First one. What's the fallacy going on here? And it may be a fallacy in a sense of visual rhetoric. I would say that this is an appeal to authority, and I'll leave you to figure out how it's doing that. How about this one? Anytime somebody quotes numbers, be a little bit wary. How many physicians are there in the world or just in America? I would imagine in the 1950s or so, or 1960s when this ad came out, that there were far more than 20,000 physicians. So is this an adequate sample size? And if not, what fallacy would that be? There's a lot going on in this advertisement, and that's partly how it tries to work, is it tries to keep you busy. But if you focus on the middle of the ad, there's a statement that is clearly false or fallacious. I don't know about you, but I can think of some things that are at least as equal to or more fun than Lionel model railroading. And this one is sort of funny. This is an old World War II propaganda poster. I'm pretty sure that going to war and going to the bathroom are not the same thing. So is this a false analogy? Thank you for watching part 2 of this presentation. I hope that you found value in it. If you have any questions, feel free to come by the Learning Commons and talk to the tutors there. This is our phone number, and of course these are our hours. We also have a writing lab that operates on Mondays and Tuesdays, and if you have any particular questions that you want answered about formatting, how to use Word, or how to phrase a particular sentence, that'd be a great time to bring those questions by. There's a tutor there, and they just there to help you if you need it. Thanks again for watching, and these are my references and places that I drew some examples from, and please, these are great resources. I would really suggest that you go and peruse them if this is a subject matter that interests you. Thank you for watching.